Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Immaculata DeVivo, and I am the Melanie Mason Nemec 71 Faculty Co-Director of the Sciences here at Harvard Radcliffe Institute. I'm also a professor of medicine at the Harvard Medical School and a professor of epidemiology at the Harvard T.H. Chan School of Public Health. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to the second installment of our summer 2025 series of Virtual Radcliffe Book Talks, which explore recent publications whose subjects or authors have connection to the Harvard Radcliffe Institute. At Radcliffe, we bring together scholars, artists, scientists, and practitioners to pursue curiosity-driven research and engage with the pressing issues of our time. Our book talk series is one of the ways we share that work with the public. Today, I am pleased to introduce my colleague, Iris Bohnet, who is the Albert Pratt Professor of Business and Government and co-director of the Women in Public Policy program at Harvard Kennedy School, as well as a faculty co-director of the Social Sciences at Radcliffe. Iris Bohnet is a behavioral economist and a co-author of Make Work Fair, Data-Driven Design for Real Results, the book we feature today, and it was published earlier this year with Siri Chilazi. Drawing on research from economics and psychology, Make Work Fair explores data-driven ways that professionals at every level in any kind of organization can make better, fairer decisions. Make Work Fair offers concrete, evidence-based tools to design systems that reduce bias and drive meaningful change and fairness across industries, systems that can help close persistent gaps in opportunity and outcomes. The book brings together rigorous data, behavioral science, and practical applications, offering a compelling case for how design of workplace structures and processes, not just good intentions, can reshape how we live and work. Joining Iris in conversation today is Oliver Hauser, a professor of economics and deputy director of the Institute for Data Science and Artificial Intelligence at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom. Oliver's research focuses on behavioral economics and leadership, and he leads the Big Ideas Project, exploring workplace equality using randomized control trials. Their discussion will be followed by an audience Q&A. We encourage those watching on Zoom to use the Q&A feature to submit your questions at any time during the program, and the speakers will address as many as they can. Since we anticipate a lot of questions, we ask that you keep them short. This will enable Iris and Oliver to address as many as possible in the time that we have. Before we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge the members of the Radcliffe Institute Leadership Society and our annual donors who are watching this afternoon. Your generosity keeps Radcliffe programming free and open to the public. We thank you. For today's program, we also gratefully acknowledge the Steiner Dean's Leadership Fund for Academic Ventures, which is supporting this event. Thank you all for being here. It is now my great pleasure to give the virtual floor to Iris, who will offer a brief reading before engaging in conversation. Iris, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Max, so much for this very kind introduction. And thank you to Oliver for joining me here today, and to all of you for being with us during this summer. So I will start by offering a short reading from the book. And in fact, I'm going to focus on chapter 7, which analyzes screening techniques that organizations use when reviewing job applications. And the subtitle of the part that I'm going to read to you is called Screened for Expertise Rather than Career Gaps. And I'm actually going to read from the book, so literally it is here with me. In addition to screening for competence, employers look for signals of commitment to infer how dedicated a job applicant might be. For example, employers tend to penalize lapses in employment as people with prolonged leaves, whether due to spells of unemployment or illness or time taken to care for children or older relatives are assumed to be less committed to the job. Such gaps on people's resumes have been shown to decrease applicants' chances of being invited to an interview. But there is an additional motherhood, and in some cases fatherhood gap, that only people with childcare responsibilities are subject to. According to a study conducted in the US by sociologist Kate Weishar, parents who discontinued work to care for their family experienced higher hiring penalties than otherwise identical mothers and fathers who had been continuously employed, or applicants whose career break was due to a job loss. Employers might have to adjust their screening processes to younger workers who are much more likely to move in and out of the workforce. They may also need to respond to new trends related to experiences during COVID-19, when people took career breaks for many different reasons. As it is increasingly difficult for employers to find job candidates without a career break, taking employment gaps as a sign of a lack of commitment is even more questionable today than it was before. Accordingly, LinkedIn now allows job seekers to add commentary to the times they left the workforce. For example, some LinkedIn users describe how caregiving made them more patient and resilient. Recent research suggests that such skills are increasingly in demand. In addition, employers are also trying to keep people who take leave in their orbit through returnship programs that aim to bring back former employees who have taken time out during their careers. But what if we could make career breaks considerations less important from the get-go? We can use behavioral design to do just that. As it happens, the typical resume format makes employment gaps particularly salient. So two of our collaborators, Ariella Crystal and Oliver Hauser, who is here with us today, saw an opportunity. Along with colleagues, they explored the impact that different ways of framing work experience on resumes would have on employer callback rates. In the winter of 2020, they responded to job postings by more than 9,000 employers in the United Kingdom across 8 different sectors, including high and low-skilled jobs such as software engineering, call center operations, finance, manufacturing, production management, and care work. They presented candidates' job history either by the number of years a job was held, or, as is commonly done, by indicating the dates during which the applicants had worked in a given job. Specifically, the revised resumes displayed a single number indicating the years worked. For example, 3 years assistant manager operation, instead of listing the exact time frame during which this occurred. For example, July 2015 through June 2018, assistant manager operations. Before sharing with you what the researchers found, we should note that work experience is neither our favorite nor the most accurate predictor of future success. But we definitely prefer years worked over employment gaps for screening purposes. While still sharing information accurately, the change in framing made the applicant's acquired expertise salient, but obfuscated employment gaps, and had quite a remarkable effect. When prior work experience was shown by the number of years worked, but without specific dates, it increased the likelihood that a candidate would be invited to an interview by 15%. This finding held for women and men, as well as for different levels of total work experience. While this reframing is gender neutral on its face, it will disproportionately benefit those more likely to have had career breaks, women. We should also note that the current traditional design most benefits those without career breaks, and that is men, reminding us that we cannot assume existing designs to be neutral. And with that, thank you for listening. And I'm very happy to invite Oliver to join me on the floor here. Oliver is both a collaborator and a great friend. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Iris. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you very much for sharing this reading. It's lovely to hear you read it because I also have my copy here, obviously, and I have to just read it by myself. It's nice to actually get it narrated from you today. So thank you very much. This book, let me just start by saying it's just a wonderful book. It's a brilliant book that you and Siri have written. So much insight, so many incredible concepts you've pulled together from so many different sources. It makes both the practitioners happy, hopefully, in the practical things they learn, and the academics who like to go for footnotes and looking at the studies themselves. So I thought I'd start off with that. I also felt that the study, well, first of all, thank you for sharing this one. I obviously happen to know it very well. But I think it's one good example of many great examples you have in what, in Make Work Fair that shows sort of the researchers behind it and how behavioral design can help to really improve how we think about processes and how we do things normally and how we might want to rethink how we should do them differently. So I really enjoyed going through this because you've also very kindly done us a favor starting at the beginning with where we should start as an organization, going through talent first develop talent requisition, development, retention, and leadership. And so I thought today's conversation could mirror that a little bit. And I feel like it's only fair to say we should start at the beginning and talk a little bit about, I'm obviously familiar with how you work, but if you're new to this, if you're a leader right now listening in, and your organization is at the beginning of this journey, what's step one for them? What are the kinds of things you think leaders and organizations should do to get ready to use these evidence-based insights?
No, thank you for this question. So first of all, I think we need to note that, of course, this isn't the beginning. It is the beginning, in a leader's life. I'm kind of thinking about equal opportunity at work. But I just want to acknowledge that, of course, these differences start much, much earlier, much before people even enter the workforce, much before children even go to school. So the beginning is kind of the beginning in that organization's life. But yes, so we encourage, Siri and we encourage organizations to let their data speak. And that just must be at the beginning of everything, really. This hasn't, it hasn't particular relevance for opportunity, but more generally, as organizations try to understand, where to sell more, whether to buy another company, whether to do a merger, or in the public sector, how to provide particular public goods to specific people. I mean, as we're all thinking about these questions, we just need to be informed by data. And that is the big passion of the book, one of the big motivators that I know you also share with Siri and myself, that it's just important to use data to diagnose what's happening. And that is kind of this first step. And that's also something that we often feel doesn't work so well in organizations where they just throw money at a problem. Often in the opportunity space, but also more generally, just maybe copying each other, what their competitors are doing and throwing money at the problem without really first diagnosing what's broken. And so we often use this analogy kind of for medicine, saying, let's be a little bit of a doctor here, diagnose what's broken, and then think about the appropriate treatment.
Excellent. That's right. I mean, I think that's brilliant. And I think just to sort of say something that stuck with me when I read the book, and you say this in many different ways, but in many ways, when we really care about something, we measure it, right? So in organizations, it's sales and other things that we do care about it. So why should we approach this topic that is so close to many CEOs' hearts, but also I think to the wider population and society more and more? We should start to measure it. And I really felt like that came through throughout the book. Data really is the driving engine, as you say in the book. So I really enjoyed, diving into that. And it made me then think, obviously, as you keep writing about data, another thing that sticks out is that you make a distinction between not just any data. It's like you need the right data and not just the right data. You need to think about the behaviors, not just attitudes. And I thought that's an important distinction. I'd love to hear a little bit more about it. Why do you think is this emphasis so important? And have we been focusing on the wrong thing until now?
Mm. Yeah, that's such a good question. In many ways, my answer is yes, that many organizations have focused very much on trying to win people's hearts and minds, and not focused enough on behavior change. And I mean, you and I are both behavioral economists, so this comes naturally to us. But, we know from so much research that attitudes don't generally or even typically translate into behaviors. They can translate into behaviors, but often much more is used to bridge that gap between virtuous intentions and the actions that we then actually take. And that gap is in fact where maybe the book is situated, by kind of giving people the toolbox to in fact act on their virtuous intentions. So yes, I have been concerned for quite a number of years about the focus on diversity training, in particular in the United States, which of course has changed in recent months. But for the last 10 to 20 years, and even actually since the Civil Rights Movement in many ways, that has been the tool of choice for organizations. And, you know, clearly for some, it was just a check the box activity. And so no wonder it didn't work. But then there were many well-intentioned organizations, again, across sectors, that really wanted to promote change and were hopeful that by raising awareness, by telling people, informing people about bias, about what's happening, about how, you know, these gaps in opportunity occur in organizations, that we might create more empathy and we might help people work together more productively. And sadly, that hasn't really happened. And we do have quite a number of studies which have explored diversity trainings, not all kind of in an experimental fashion. So when Oliver and I talk about experiments, what we mean is literally that you give some people the treatment. That's also what Oliver and colleagues did in their study that I just mentioned before. In my reading, you give some people the treatment, you give some people the new framing, and then you don't give that to other people. So in the diversity training space, that would mean some of us go through diversity training and some others might not get any training, or we might just get a different training about something completely different in the organization. And then we are measuring whether people with the training behave differently down the road. And that's such a hard problem, because what we do see in the data is that we can raise awareness. People do know more about the value of diversity, for example, or how unequal opportunity can occur. But, you know, a month, 2 months, 2 years later, they will have forgotten even those insights. And more importantly, they will not have applied those insights to their daily work.
Yeah, that is obviously, you know, a bit of a shocking sort of revelation, I think. It must be for a lot of organizations who really, like you say, have been on a mission to maybe do on their own the best they can for their employees to make work fair, and then to realize that some of the tools they may have been using haven't actually translated into the outcomes that they really care about. I think that's obviously a challenge, right? So I guess could you maybe give a little bit of an example of how you think behavioral design can solve some of this intention action gap that you pointed out, right? In many ways, I think it's encouraging. We should probably be encouraged by the fact that people signal through attitudes that they see the benefits of some of this change and they want to see that more. And that, you know, if you look at survey data, younger people maybe say that more so. But you make this point throughout the book that it's so much about behavioral design. It's not just throwing, you know, an idea at it and say, well, it's got to work. So what could you do? You can, you know, maybe talk about the diversity training would be great, or another example that comes to mind where you really think that's a nice way that organizations could do behavioral design to solve one of these intention action gaps.
Yes, no, absolutely. In fact, Oliver, this makes me think of a study that we did together with Siri and others, Chanson Arslan and Edward Chang from the Harvard Business School. And it's a bit of an interesting story that might also be relevant for the people who are joining us today, in that I think our group, in many ways, had given up on diversity training because the evidence had been so strong. And in fact, one of our group members, Edward Chang, was part of another team of researchers who have done an experiment, a randomized controlled trial on diversity training, and have been quite surprised by how little they were finding. So in any case, about 2 years ago, we got together, Oliver, Siri, and Chanson and Edward, and thought that, you know, given that many organizations are so passionate about their trainings, maybe we should try to make them better. And that, you know, that was the beginning of a really interesting project that we were able to do with a large telecommunications and engineering company, that's headquartered in Europe, but is a multinational with about 100,000 employees. And I think we had a number of insights, as you will recall, Oliver. But for me, the two most important ones, by the way, when I say we had a number of insights, we kind of threw behavioral science at the problem. So right, this was, the kitchen sink approach a little bit. But the two that stood out for me or still stand out, even though I have no evidence to say that they are the most important ones, but the two that stand out for me are, first, that we felt that most of these trainings are just too generic.
Yeah.
They don't speak to me as an employee, and they don't really address the topics that I worry about in my daily jobs, my responsibilities, the types of decisions that I have to make. And I think that was the first important insight for me. And then secondly, we also felt that not only are they pretty generic, and don't speak to me directly, but also they happen at a random moment in time. So they might happen during onboarding or just always in September. We do a repeat diversity training or unconscious bias training. And so these are, two important insights for me. And anyway, so that's what we did. We felt that we need to target the audience. So we didn't want to speak broadly. We wanted to speak to a particular subgroup of people who had a particular job to do, basically tomorrow or the next week. Very, very soon. And so we focused on hiring managers, and we focused on hiring managers during a particular moment in their life, namely when they had to move people from the long list to the short list. And the intervention was short. It was a 7-minute video. Calling it, a program might be even an exaggeration. It might be more of a reminder, guidelines, kind of helping people kind of crystallize what the job of screening people, selecting people from the long list to short list, what that entails. And then kind of in a nutshell, the message was about the values that this company upholds, and that included diversity. And it also was about the particular issues that hiring managers might want to think about, including focusing on skills, that when you hire and select somebody, right, we do know from lots of research that skills are among the better predictors of future performance. And so anyway, so we ran a randomized control trial with actually 3 treatment arms, but the 2 I'm going to focus on are the diversity intervention versus a control treatment. And what we found was that the group that the company had identified, they wanted to hire more of. And that was in particular women and people from outside of the hiring country, which is a bit strange maybe, but think this is a multinational company, right? They're in Spain and they are in Guatemala and in Japan, and they don't want the Japanese to just hire the Japanese and Spaniards to just hire Spaniards, but they wanted their employees to benefit from the incredible global talent pool they had. And so that's why they focused on this global people. And that's what they found. So in particular, they ended up hiring more women from outside of the hiring country. So I think the summary of this, Oliver, for me is that in whatever intervention we do, we have to think hard about our audience. We kind of have to start with our audience, which for marketing people, of course, is not new insight. Shouldn't be a new insight. Really, we always start with our customer. We always start with our client. We always start with the people we want to reach. And we try to inform kind of their decisions at a moment that matters to them.
That's brilliant. Thank you so much. And obviously nice that you picked another one that I know very well. So I have to say, like, I'm going to promise I'm not going to try and ask for another study that we have done together. But just to say, I like that one as well. And I like that you picked out some of the, active ingredients of what may have been the driving factors behind this. Very hard to pin down at this stage. I guess we'll hope future research will show us more of the way of what else, could be driving. But I agree, the fact that it was specific to this organization, like you say, understand who your audience is, and also make it really timely. That stuck with me as well. And I guess the other thing that I remember thinking is that because you call on organizations to really engage in this process, I remember thinking that the organization, the multinational organization we work with, and then there's sort of an organization helping implement this more than now. Both of these, were pioneers in really trying to do this at this scale and with this method of randomized controlled trials. So I remember thinking this was also really like walking the talk, really testing out what works. So I remember thinking, like you say, we may have thought that we gave up on diversity training. I'm glad we didn't, because we found something new. And I think it's a nice example of sort of an intervention that an employer can do. It's an interesting thing to ask, actually, what more could employers do, right? So I remember in reading your book, you have such amazing experiences and such amazing things you've done. So I remember reading about another, what I would call a demand side. If you consider the supply side being the applicants and the organization, the demand side, I remember thinking that's such a cool thing that you did with the Nobel Prize Committee, and I feel like I'd love for you to tell us more about the Nobel Prize Committee, because who wouldn't want to hear about them? And amazingly, you helped them redesign their process a bit, and I think other organizations could learn from that. So if you wouldn't mind sharing some more of this process of not just hiring, promotion, but starting with the Nobel Prize Committee.
Yeah, no, thank you for raising that. Maybe I'm going to take a step back and just, I want to just spend a moment talking about this distinction that you made, this very helpful distinction, that, mostly what we see are outcomes of multiple behaviors from multiple people at multiple times. And in economics, I do think we have this helpful framework that we're saying, well, there's the supply side. These are the job seekers. These are the employees. These are people who, for a variety of reasons, might not lean in, to use another term that is well known to our audience, might not lean in as much as their counterparts. So women less likely to lean in than men. And, are there interventions targeting these types of challenges? So that's one bucket. And and that's an important bucket. But most of my work has focused on the demand side more, although I've done a little bit on supply side as well, but more on demand side, as in saying, okay, let's level the playing field in organizations. That's the organization's responsibility. It certainly isn't a woman's responsibility to lean in more. We shouldn't try to fix people, and we can't fix people. And fixing is also, it's a big term, but so let's focus on the systems that affect these types of behaviors. And that also led to the advice that I gave the Nobel Prize Foundation. That is actually, it's a bit of an interesting story because it wasn't actually research. Is built on research, but the advice, with the Nobel Prize Foundation, you can't really go and say, I'd love to run an experiment. Could we treat some of the nominees differently from others? That isn't quite possible. So it never turned into an experiment, but a few years ago, actually now, almost 10 years ago, in 2016, Max Beserman, Alexander van Geen, and I published a paper that looked at how we make these types of decisions, including the decision that the Nobel Prize Foundation makes, but also decisions that you all make when you promote somebody or when you hire somebody, that sometimes these are one-off decisions. So imagine there's a corporate board, somebody steps down, you have to find a new director. You have to replace a person. So it's kind of a one-person decision. And sometimes somebody has an outside offer. That happens quite a bit in academia. And then you compete for that professor. And so again, it's very focused on this one person. And we felt, based on some studies that one of our collaborators, Max Beserman, had actually done before, not focusing on diversity at all, that sometimes diversity and accuracy, which is kind of lovely, are more likely to emerge. And that happens when we look at more than one candidate or make more than one decision at a time. And we call this joint decision-making versus separate decision-making. And we did find in the experiment that we ran in 2016 that joint decision-making, in fact, helps us focus more on candidates' qualifications, their competencies, rather than their demographic characteristics. And what was kind of important was that the same was true for men and women. So we looked at women applicants to male stereotyped domains, and we looked at male applicants in female typed domains. And, both men and women were disadvantaged depending on the stereotype, whether the prevalent stereotype advantages women or men. And anyway, so we were able to overcome that and help evaluators actually focus on the talent rather than these social identities. And that's what I suggested to the Nobel Prize Foundation, because every year I got a letter from the Nobel Prize Foundation, and I still do now, that asked me to nominate a person for the Nobel Prize in Economics. And I dutifully nominated one person, but I recommended to the committee to make it very explicit that people like me could nominate more than one person. Apparently, this was possible beforehand. I didn't even know, but it wasn't made salient. But now the new form has literally 3 entries, as in, make 3 nominations. And there's nothing magic about the number 3. I don't know that is, it is a magic number in many ways, but there's no research saying that 3 is the optimal number. It's probably not 10 because that's cognitive overload. It's bigger than 1, but it helps us calibrate our judgments, right? As I'm thinking about these 3 candidates already, I'm starting to think about how they compare to each other. And of course, homogeneity is a bit more into my face. When all of the 3 people for the Nobel Prize in Economics are, white, male, Harvard economists, for example, that is very much into my face. But when I make these one-off decisions, it's much more likely that I go with the type of person that I'm used to, that has typically been awarded the Nobel Prize. Now, the prize committee, as you said, did change the form, and they introduced this new mechanism. And I can talk about it. I should make that clear too, because they wrote about it themselves in the scientific magazine Nature. But we did many other things. But I had to sign, of course, a non-disclosure agreement, and so I can't talk about other procedural changes they introduced. And that maybe just even as a side might be important also for our listeners, that so many people we talk to, including journalists, would love for us to say so much more, and they're just restrictions. Sometimes we don't know more because we don't have the data to say more, but sometimes we can't name the company. For example, Oliver and I just didn't name the multinational telecommunications and engineering company because we don't have agreement from them to do so, so we don't. And then sometimes you can't talk about specific things that you did because, again, you signed an NDA. Having said this, we, of course, love working with proprietary data. We completely understand that organizations have to be careful. And we as researchers, in many ways, want to make their lives easier. We want them to learn from the data analysis and the experiment that we might run with them. And we want to be able to share this with the world so that the world can learn.
Absolutely. I think that's brilliant. I think in so many ways, this is one of those cases where I think we're all better off if we did more sharing and learning together, right? I think it's a case where we keep having organizations come to us and ask for best practices, but sometimes, we might not always be able to talk about it. But if we can publish some of this, what a great opportunity to contribute to this public good, that we're getting more diversity and more fairness into workplaces. So I completely agree. Obviously, your response definitely makes me think I'm very much hoping that other people who are receiving the form to fill in names for the Nobel Prize will be naming you a lot. So I'm keeping my fingers crossed for that. But also you mentioned something else that I sort of felt like would be nice to build off, which is the study, the 2016 study. I remember it well. I really like still going back to it. I think it's a really beautiful design. It also studied, like you say, gender in both directions. And you mentioned this in your book, that while most of the focus of your book is obviously on women, in particular, the barriers they face as they progress through the organization, but you also point out that men also sometimes experience that. I remember in the 2016 paper, you on purpose tested that and found that. But would you mind maybe sharing a little bit about, what are men experiencing potentially in the workplace in terms of inequality? Are the interventions different or often maybe the same? So it'd be great to hear a little bit about the insights you've gained from organizations you've worked with there.
No, so it's a huge topic, and I am not the best person to answer the question. But I will obviously answer the question, but I'm saying it's a huge research topic. that more people should go into. I'm basically trying to encourage the audience here to study more of the areas where men are falling behind. It's a younger area than focusing on women falling behind. But for example, Richard Reeves has this wonderful book on boys and men, where he talks about HEAL professions. So think of this as an acronym, kind of along the same lines as STEM, where STEM still is our fields where women traditionally fall behind: science, technology, engineering, and math. And at HEAL, the H stands for health, the E for education, A for administration, and L for literacy. Again, suggesting that men are falling behind in those areas. And then also discussing the implications. So, for example, think about education. We now know that boys are increasingly falling behind in school. They're less likely to get into tertiary education, less likely to attend college, more likely to drop out of high school, more likely to have worse grades than girls. And this comes with us having fewer male teachers. And particularly male teachers in I'm saying this in quotation marks, counter stereotypical subjects, such as English language, for example. So it's incredibly important to have more men enter into HEAL professions, as it is incredibly important for women to enter into STEM professions. Now, Oliver, you asked me a bigger question in some ways, and that is, do the interventions that we test, that you also test, but that we in behavioral science maybe test, do they work for everyone, or under which conditions, do they work for women better than men? Not even thinking about non-binary individuals, of course, about whom we have basically no data, very, very little data, no experimental data. Or for people of different ethnic or racial, national origin, sexual orientations, etc. And that is a hard question, kind of to holistically respond. But I'm going to give you maybe two examples that might speak to that. One, you'll see doesn't work for everyone necessarily, and then the other one does. So it turns out that many of the interventions that we test just improve decision making. So it's not favoring anyone. It's just basically taking out bias and noise from our decisions. And I alluded to in passing once in a while, kind of even when I read, I said, work experience, it turns out, empirically speaking, is not the best predictor of future performance. What is one of the best predictors at this point are skills-based assessments, work sample tests. So where we literally, if we hire somebody, to code, just to give a very simple example, when we hire a coder, good idea to have the person write some code. So not rocket science, but still not done enough. That turns out to diversify the people we end up hiring, but that wasn't even the primary objective necessarily. It just made our decision-making more accurate. And that should just help anyone. That should help men in counter stereotypical professions, such as nursing or elementary school education. That should help women in information technology or engineering, where the stereotypes might work against them. So that's, that's one bucket, I think. And then another bucket of interventions focuses more on gender dynamics that we know about. And you will laugh, Oliver, but I'm going to go, and maybe that's the last study I'm going to talk about, but I'm going to go back to one of our joint papers too, mostly because it's so fresh in my mind and we worked so hard to submit the paper to a journal just last week. But I think it's going to illustrate this point very much. So this is an interesting paper because it actually came to us through an organization in Australia. So one of the largest employers in Australia had a challenge, and they had identified the challenge already because, in fact, they do have still a behavioral insights team in-house, and they had done the data analysis, and that found that when people apply to a job, not everyone gets the job. I mean, most everyone doesn't get the job. So most everyone is rejected. And then the organization noted that of the rejected applicants, men were about twice as likely to reapply than women. And that was their puzzle. Saying, you know, we're losing all that talent. We've now vetted everyone, reviewed everyone, gone through the whole process, and we would love for them to apply to a similar position, but they don't. And that was our entry. And in fact, the experiment turned out to be quite simple, but it illustrates the point that the same intervention might not work for everyone the same way. And here what we did was basically build on research suggesting that women tend to be somewhat less self-confident than men. And particularly in, again, these counter-stereotypical domains. And what this organization was particularly focused on were positions of leadership. And sadly, still today, leadership in our mind is kind of male-typed. And so we wondered whether if we kind of decreased ambiguity for the applicants, for everyone, maybe women would be more likely to apply. Maybe women would be encouraged to apply if we told them how they compared to other applicants. So what we did was we focused on the top 20% of the applicants based on the analysis that the organization had done. And we sent them a message telling them that they are top 20%. We did a few additional things. We sent them some additional signals in other arms of the treatment that we don't have to dwell on right now. But what was interesting was that learning about the top 20% kind of closed the gender gap in reapplication rates. And interestingly, you'll see my advanced stats here. It also affected men. And that's a bit of a puzzle for us still today, meaning that so you're told you're top 20%, and now you are less likely to reapply than when you don't know anything. How is that possible? And so we're speculating, although we have a bit of a hunch based on some additional work that we've done, that maybe some of us assumed that we are top 5%. And if we're told that we're only top 20%, we take this as a signal that we're not quite as good as we thought we are. Now, we don't quite know whether that's in fact what happened, but that's kind of the interesting dynamic here, which is why I wanted to give this as an example that, you know, boosting self-confidence works for people who have low self-confidence. In fact, that is something that Oliver and I and our collaborators just showed. Not a big surprise. But it doesn't necessarily help those who already have a very high self-confidence. It might be neutral to them, or in our case, maybe even negative news. So we can't assume an intervention always works for everyone. It depends a bit on the theory behind and why we introduce a certain type of change.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I mean, I think that speaks to so many organizational problems, I'm sure, out there, right? Sort of to summarize, one of the things that I think is nice with the two buckets. The first one is this idea of debiasing and building better processes and systems. How we make decisions helps everybody. Really, really important. And the second point you made around some things don't work for everybody kind of reminds me of what you said right at the beginning, that some things maybe beyond one organization to even fix, like it could be that confidence is just so socialized that especially, say, women in leadership positions, like you said, are often associated in this sort of male-dominated and male stereotype domain. That it's really hard to assume that they would that the same intervention would work, and therefore thinking about interventions slightly differently, I think is a really good reminder. Again, probably also a reminder why we should test these things, because they're not always, as we have found. And I promise I didn't expect you to bring up this pivot. You're right. It is top of mind, and we didn't expect some of the things that we found. And therefore, I think all the more helpful for us to find out more about them. Now, I'm going to move us into the Q&A from our audience. And I want to encourage people who haven't had a chance to do this yet, do feel free to write your questions in here as soon as you can. I'm going to start to bring together some of those questions now. And one thing that comes to mind is, and let's talk a bit about leadership, I think, just to make sure, because I think it's such an interesting topic and lots of questions always around leadership, especially for women. And your book talks a lot about leadership. It talks about middle managers in particular having quite an important role to play. There's a gender gap there. You mentioned, bias from above, from below, and how that impacts women's career trajectories. I guess one thing that comes to mind as well, and bringing sort of one other theme from the questions, is like, are there differences in organizations you've seen, small and large, or are we sort of, are you seeing patterns more in terms of the career progression, junior, middle, and senior level management. So I'd love to hear what you've sort of found and want to share with the audience.
I might be able to kind of bring those two together in some ways, the middle manager and the question of difference here. And I'm thinking of a German-based, actually, manufacturer, large manufacturer. And it's an interesting example because what they found was that women didn't want to become leaders, didn't want to be managers. So this goes back to the supply side in some ways, right? Where we're thinking, wow, why is that? Are women responding to something in the environment? Is it intrinsic? What's happening? And it turns out that only 7% of the leaders of this organization are in fact women. And so women at the lower rank don't have role models to look up to, and they also don't have a sense of how progress might be happening for them in this organization. And the interesting thing was that these women, so these were, by the way, this was the first promotion. So very early in someone's career, think 28-year-old, 30-year-old, 32-year-old. So very early in the career, and they didn't want to be promoted. They did want to be, so you should actually reframe that. They did want to be promoted, but they didn't want to have responsibility for a team. So it's not that they didn't want to have more interesting work or responsibility, but they were nervous about leading a team specifically. And that is related to what you just mentioned, Oliver, that in many situations, and that's actually true across geographies. Now that I think of the book, I think we have many examples from African countries, actually, in that particular area, where employees didn't want to listen, didn't take a woman leader seriously. Kind of it violated their norms, their assumptions about what a good leader looks like and who a good leader is, and weren't following advice. For example, in agriculture, there's a really lovely study kind of on agricultural techniques and how women leaders were taken less seriously, even though they were actually right in their advice. So I think that's discrimination from below, which we don't talk a lot about, I don't think. We don't have a ton of evidence either, but it was important for Siri and me to also kind of highlight that it's not always, discrimination from above that might lead to somebody not being promoted or not being chosen for a leadership position. But it is that fear that sadly, in some circumstances, is justified, that the person will experience backlash. I mean, and just to give one more example, then I'll stop, but another example we're giving in that context is actually professors and students, just because we are in an academic context. It's not quite the same, right? But it's not exactly the same. But if you think of kind of the professor also as somebody who gives guidance, advice, insights, etc., then the question is, are students listening to counter stereotypical professors? And again, a study from France, one from the US, also kind of suggests that sadly, particularly younger female professors have a much harder time to be taken seriously in the classroom.
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, actually, it's interesting that you brought up that last example. You just answered another question I was going to ask from the audience. That's excellent. There's you've done that job brilliantly already, but I think you're absolutely right. And it's so important to think about these different contexts where we might see this sort of bias from below and probably haven't paid enough attention to it. And so I think it's going to be important. I'm thinking, going back to what you said about data and collecting that data, how important that will be to make sure we have the right information to make judgments and decisions, and then design processes to reduce that from happening.
Oliver, if I can jump in, maybe just, think course evaluations, right, in our context, but then think what the analogy of that is in a more standard organization, not in academia. It might be your performance appraisals. And in theory, right, we're thinking it's a great idea to have a 360 where we learn a lot from lots of different people. But if these dynamics apply, if bias from below is big, then that might not give us the best results. So it's a really complex problem.
Yeah, interesting. Absolutely right. It is complex. And there's another question that someone from the audience asked, and I think sort of to follow up on that, are you, in the work you've done, are you finding that employees don't listen to female middle managers so much? And I guess one thing that comes to mind is, building off this question is sort of thinking around other cultures and where we have seen maybe examples of how women were elevated into potentially leadership positions to change some of those stereotypes. Have you gotten examples of that? Maybe to sort of speak to this question around, where leaders, how they can change those stereotypes, especially around women in leadership.
Yeah, so that might not be great news for the person who asked the question because I don't know where the person comes from, but numbers do matter. There's just no running away from numbers. So if you work in a counter-stereotypical profession, in an industry, in a company that is, where women are very highly underrepresented, it's incredibly hard to overcome the stereotypes. So numbers really do matter. And a very nice study, which comes from a different sector, but I am at the Kennedy School, so I'm going to go into the public sector for a moment as well, comes actually from India, because India has the best data on kind of a random experiment where the Indian government in 1993 amended its constitution with a provision that a third of village heads had to be women. And the third literally was picked out of a hat. So that's kind of the randomness, which we always like in data analysis. And we now have about 25 papers analyzing that experiment, a natural experiment, literally over the years. And it does demonstrate that these experiences with female leaders really do matter. So it's not the first time that I see a woman mayor that I'm starting to think, wow, women are great at this. But interestingly enough, it's in the villages that have been exposed to at least two women, and by now more, but two women is when that paper was written, where people are starting to associate leadership with women, and they're starting to also report, for example, that they'd love for their daughters to become politicians because they've just now seen that this is possible for women. And actually in the book, we now think of Siri because Siri is Finnish American. We talk about Tarja Halonen, the former president of Finland, and her story that you surely have heard talk about before, where she visited kindergarten and a little boy kind of asked her whether boys and men could become political leaders as well. So that's how these images, so seeing really is believing. And so salient figures can be helpful too. If you don't have the numbers, I mean, the numbers are ideal, right? So India is such a powerful example because it changed numbers very quickly and people started to see difference. And lots of people started to see, different differences, which is also important, not just to stereotype, oh, this is what women are like, or this is what men are like, or this is what, somebody from this particular ethnic background is like. So that's what numbers are helpful. Having said this, if you don't have the numbers, then salient figures, such as, of course, heads of state, but also mayors, teachers, anyone, local club leaders, anyone. I'm thinking of the women's soccer teams now. I know we have a very global audience, so not everyone has been following the European Soccer Championship, but I have. And it has been such a great success for women's sport. And also, of course, it's hosted in my home country, Switzerland, so it was even more prevalent for me. But in any case, I'm just saying, so these are also role models. I predict that many, many more girls will take up soccer, having seen these women perform so strongly as they have.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that brings nicely together the work you've been talking about before around role models as well. And in some ways also relatable role models, right? I remember thinking that when I read this, that, someone playing football, I mean, at this league is of course like very top league, but still very early on in life, you can explore and you can find out that this is actually really fun and you can sort of work your way up. And probably in organizations, we need to think about ways, where are these relatable role models? If you don't have the numbers, who are the people that people can see and feel like, okay, I could be this and I can move forward in this organization. I'm going to sort of, I have a couple more questions. I'm going to bring us back to process in one of the questions, which is, I'm very curious about the discussion you had in pay transparency in the book as well. And sort of pay often comes up also in questions. And so I'm wondering, this is fascinating because there are some people who are really for pay transparency and some who are not. But I think what I remember reading, and I'd love to hear more from you, is like sometimes it's good and sometimes it has unintended consequences. But you also make really clear points about like what actually does work, especially in an area like pay.
I think pay transparency is such a great example of the importance of design. Not every pay transparency law is created equal. That's just a fact. And we now have about 18 different designs around the world, including among US states, which have been trying out different versions of pay transparency, but also globally. Denmark was one of the early countries, maybe the earliest country, 2006, introducing pay transparency. But at the time, Denmark focused very much on internal equity. And that's kind of what the research suggests at this point, that schemes or designs that make internal pay comparisons easily available to employees might not work as well. One example that is close to maybe Oliver and my heart is in academia, for example, at the public universities in California, so University of California, Berkeley, for example. Pay and faculty pay is transparent, completely transparent. And when I was academic dean at the Kennedy School, it was very handy that I could check, oh, what does an economist who's been out of grad school for 10 years, what do they make at Berkeley, for example? And not only I looked at that, but also the job candidates had looked at that before. And so it was helpful for me to have that kind of information. But research does suggest that it doesn't make people particularly happy. And it shouldn't surprise anyone that it doesn't make us happy, because it's actually not a behavioral science, in that it is incredibly hard for us to be objective generally and with ourselves.
Yes,
Right. So then I'm surely going to feel some envy if I learn that my office neighbor makes whatever 20K more. And so that's the hard part. So the internal comparisons, I don't think is quite the way to go. I think human nature doesn't lend itself to that type of transparency. Having said this, people then might think, oh, well, therefore, we can't be transparent at all with pay. Now, of course, clever designers have thought about different ways of making pay transparent, and that is now much more externally focused. So, for example, Massachusetts has a law that mandates that organizations like mine, Harvard, for example, have to post salary ranges when we post a job advertisement. And it turns out that those types of designs also help us close the gender pay gap, but don't necessarily have those negative consequences that we see when we do the internal transparency.
Yeah, that's brilliant. I mean, such a good example again of how you can solve an issue by just building it a bit better. But if you make a mistake in the design, it can sort of backfire, and you have this social comparison and make nobody happy. Really interesting. We are nearly out of time, so I'm gonna have to sort of bring the conversation slowly to a close. But I'd love for you to maybe reflect and share a little bit. I mean, just before we do it, just say this is such a brilliant book, and hopefully people can see it here. Do buy it and read all of the details. But what would you advise now for people who haven't read it yet, but you should read it? What should they do going out? Whether you're a leader or somebody in an organization who wants to make work fair, what are sort of the last bits of advice? Even just one thing they could do tomorrow.
One thing they could do tomorrow, become a micro sponsor.
Hmm.
So I'm ending with an example that literally all of us can do. Become more aware of the types of things that happen around you. For example, in a meeting, if somebody's interrupted or somebody is not given credit for the comment they just made, or somebody just never speaks up, kind of take them aside after the meeting, talk to them, even if you're not the team leader, just as a colleague or in the team meeting, you might be the one kind of to add something and basically bring the discussion back to Jamila, who might have made a comment and nobody ever paid attention to it. And then John later on kind of repeated the comment, and then it was a big thing. You can easily then jump in and say, oh, John, love your comment. So happy you're building on what Jamila just said earlier. And I don't think we kind of had enough time to really learn about where this might take us. So that's something I personally try to do in meetings all the time now. Once it becomes a habit, honestly, you can't stop doing it. So try to do something like that. Everyone can be a micro sponsor for somebody else, and these little acts of fairness and of generosity can really make a difference.
Wonderful. I mean, that's if that's not a great call to action for everybody who's listening, then I don't know what is. So this does bring this program to a close for today. And I really want to thank Iris again, Iris Bohnet, for the wonderful reading, but also the book you've written, the fascinating conversation, and also the great questions from the audience. So thank you very much, everybody. For those of you who couldn't be here today, don't worry, this has been recorded and it will be posted on the Radcliffe website. If you're very keen, you're welcome to watch it again too on the website. There will be more information for upcoming Radcliffe's programs, in particular for 2 more virtual summer book talks with Radcliffe affiliated authors, Allegra Goodman and Geraldine Brooks. And if you want to see any of the past videos, please visit radcliffe.harvard.edu. Thank you again for joining us today and take care.